This unearthly device is a Grumman lunar module, the most specialized yet most broadly capable manned space vehicle ever built. On July 20th, 1969, a sister ship of this one, here in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, flew from its Apollo 11 mothercraft to the surface of the moon and back again, safely carrying the first two human beings ever to set foot on a non-terrestrial surface. In 1961, when he was a young engineer of 32, Thomas J. Kelly headed the design of that remarkable machine. But America's quest for the moon actually began 4 years earlier, on a fateful day in 1957.
I still remember when the Sputnik was launched, which kind of was a rude awakening for this country and for me personally about the space age.
When the Sputnik came along, it just gave impetus to what we were doing. And I guess I personally appreciated it. It was like being able to give the government a prod to do what you thought they should be doing all along.
Some found consolation in the shock, but Sputnik was a public relations disaster for the United States. Yet worse was to come. First, the Soviets sent a dog into orbit, then a man. By 1961, John F. Kennedy was president. For him, the worsening situation represented a direct political challenge.
We insisted that we should see the president. We felt it was an important issue, and we did see President Kennedy. And he was really not prepared to make a decision on the follow-on to Mercury, which was Apollo. Even in those days, it was called Apollo. But he did agree to go ahead with the development of the larger booster, the Saturn. And then about, I would guess, offhand, maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, cosmonaut Gagarin orbited the Earth. And at that point, President Kennedy realized that there was an immediate policy issue. A paper was put together that outlined a manned program to the moon and said that McNamara and Webb felt that that was the right goal to take, that it was an achievable goal.
Well, that's the reason that we really got the program going so well, is because the people in this country thought that the Russians were ahead of us. And of course, the Russians were ahead of us.
On May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard became America's first man in space. The flight was embarrassingly brief in duration, simply a ballistic lob to an altitude of 116 miles and a water landing barely 300 miles downrange. But the emotional impact was enormous. The United States allowed the world to watch, something the Soviets would never have dared. We were in the race, and exactly 20 days later, John Kennedy named the finish line.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It was an awesome, perhaps even impossible goal, for nobody had yet seriously considered the question of exactly how to land a vehicle on the moon, or more important, get it off again.
When the original idea of going to the moon was conceived, NASA hadn't really pinned down exactly how they were going to go to the moon. The lunar orbit rendezvous approach was an alternative. I think it was a pretty ingenious alternative. The person who is credited with having come up with the original idea is John Hobart at NASA, and we read one of his early papers on that, and we checked all the calculations ourselves, and it seemed like a pretty attractive idea to us. So in the final analysis, the lunar orbit rendezvous approach was selected because it was more economical. Specifically, the command module could be specialized for re-entry, which is a very demanding environment and requires a hard, compact, heat-resistant vehicle in order to survive, aerodynamically shaped. In contrast, the lunar module
was able to be specialized for operations in space and on the moon, where it has no aerodynamics to contend with and very little in the way of forces, either gravity or anything else.
The request for bid on the lunar module was unique in my experience in that it did not ask for a specific design. It was almost like a game of 20 questions. You answer these questions, and if we think you know what you're talking about, we'll talk to you later. And consequently, we tried to do that. Now, to answer the questions, we had to postulate a design. And that really is what was shown in that little wood model that sits up there on the shelf. We thought that, in effect, when we finally did receive indication that we were the winners, that we would develop that design. But it turned out that no, we had just passed the entrance examination, and that we would have to work with what is now the Johnson Center to develop a design. So in effect, the preliminary design of the lunar module started from scratch after the award.
That development work began in November 1962 when it was announced that Grumman had won the LEM competition. It wasn't the first time Grumman had been on the leading edge.
The best analogy to the problem of designing a spacecraft that seemed to be a fighter airplane. We didn't know anything about space any more than most people did at that time, but we did know a lot about producing reliable flying machines that had to operate in a very hostile and demanding environment. If you think about the skills that we had available from the aircraft design world, were really very directly applicable to the design of the lunar module. But everything else was a very logical extension of the aircraft designer's desire to go higher, faster, and farther.
At regular intervals during the design of the lunar module, Grumman built full-size models of the machine. With these mock-ups, engineers could check the fit of systems, astronauts could practice their procedures, and NASA could evaluate Grumman's progress.
NASA would come with literally hundreds of people. They would include all the astronauts and all the leaders of the various NASA centers and their supporting cast of engineers and experts. Now, in the case of the LEM, the crew had a lot of contact with the LEM besides just flying it from inside the crew compartment. It also served as their home base when it was on the moon, and the descent stage housed all the scientific equipment. All of those aspects of the LEM that the crew would actually use had to be evaluated in the mock-ups.
We had a sling with like a big bungee that ran down from the ceiling, and what the astronaut would do would hook it onto his suit, and he would go up the ladder, ingress and egress out of the LEM. And it was quite interesting, and if you ever got on one of those things, it was quite a thrill. It's like jumping off of a tree into water and then bouncing back up again.
The design of the landing gear is an interesting story in itself. Now, this was influenced by a couple of factors. It was influenced by the theories as to what the lunar surface might consist of. They varied all the way from a very light, powdery dust into which the whole LEM might sink. That was one extreme. The other extreme was that it was going to be ice, very slippery, very hard in some areas.
On a 250,000-mile trip, weight was critical. As the design developed from concept to hardware, the shape and structure changed in several significant ways.
When you compare these two models, the proposal model and the final version of the LEM, many of the differences that you see
the result of our desire to save weight on the lunar module. This proposal model had aircraft-style seats. We realized that we really didn't need seats in 0G or even 16G. So in this LEM and in the real LEMs, the crew was in a stand-up position. So what we were able to do, since the crew was standing up, we were able to design it such that the window was very close to the crew's eye. And that basically cut down the glass area drastically.
While the vehicle was being built in Bethpage, Grumman had to test the LEM's engines as well. The fuel was far too dangerous to mix or store anywhere short of a desert. And a desert was where Grumman went, to White Sands, New Mexico.
And a spear point operation, which White Sands was, because it came so far in advance of the operations at the Cape. Initially, we had to find out whether this descent engine could be fired, gimbaled, throttled, and would it in fact fire as long as this descent mission lasted. And we had an altitude chamber for the descent stage, and we had an altitude chamber for the ascent stage. The ascent stage was far more critical in the mission than the descent stage because it had no backup. And if there was anything that had to be absolutely perfect in the lunar module, it was the ascent engine. Because if you press the button to go back out into orbit around the moon and it didn't fire, the astronauts were lost.
In 3 wars, Grumman airplanes built a reputation for bringing their crews back alive. The LEM would too. Each LEM would be used just once, but Grumman built them to last.
The actual building was done in a very handcrafted, customized fashion, and in many, many cases, you were strictly relying on the integrity of that particular workman, because after he put something together, it was very, very difficult to tell whether it had been done properly or not. Consequently, when the LEM was in the factory, you could hardly see it. It was surrounded by scaffolding and protective covers of all types, both externally and inside the crew compartment.
We also had a rotate and clean machine, which they also called a tumbler. And what that did was, I think we had 3 cycles of tumbling. And it took all of the debris and dust and rivet tails and what have you, and we would catch it and weigh it on a big canvas sheet. And as you progressed along better and everybody got more used to working with this type of environment, the ships became much cleaner.
Here on Earth, the LEM was out of its element. Amid the bustle of a factory, the LEM was fragile, delicate. In fact, its outermost skin was a high-tech version of what people used to call tinfoil.
On the surface of the moon, you went from like plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the sunlight to minus 250 in the shade, and that happened fairly abruptly. The strategy, the design strategy that we used was to wrap the lunar module in insulation so that it would be basically thermally isolated from its surroundings. Now that insulation was mylar. It was an aluminized mylar. The mylar itself was kind of a gold color, and it's very prominent in any of the pictures of the LEM that you see.
The only way pilots could practice maneuvering and landing the LEM was with flight simulators and awkward lunar lander rigs. Never before had a flying machine gone into actual service without a single test flight. But for the LEM, there was no other way. No other way, that is, than to test every system separately and together on the ground, every step of the way.
We tested at the component level, we tested at the assembly level, we tested at the subsystem level, and of course we finally tested at the all-up level. And statistically, you couldn't prove reliability of the kind that we felt we had to have. So we adopted the policy that there's no such thing as a random failure. and that every failure had to be examined, had to be understood, and some action had to be taken to eliminate that cause.
What made people work so hard? Certainly there were rewards for wallet, ego, and resume, but the greatest reward was that the LEM was destined for greatness. And everyone who came in contact with the spidery machine that Grumman was building knew it.
There was a dedication and a drive on the lunar module program that I haven't seen equaled since. I've seen it equaled in very small groups, but we're talking about thousands of people here that were swept up in the enthusiasm and the historic importance of this endeavor.
This wasn't just another flying machine. This was unusual. It had not been done before. And I think there's something that many engineers respond to in the sense that it is at the forefront of knowledge and that there are risks being taken.
You got kind of caught up into something that you had no control with. There was a national goal to put a man on the moon, and it was something that we all just got so engrossed with and became so dedicated to or obsessed with that you would do anything you had to, go wherever you had to in order to get the spacecraft ready.
We thought we had hyped ourselves into thinking, you know, we could do it. We believed we could do it. And there was something there, there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. We could see it. We knew we were part of it, and we could see the progress we were making. And then we were all 20 years younger. At that time, the average age of the NASA and their contractors were, you know, probably around 30, 25 to 30. That age, you believe you can do anything. You know, you can move mountains, and we actually believe that. So we got caught up in it, and it was we were addicted. We'd rather be here than go home.
The spirit I saw at Grumman in those days with the LEM was to almost be willing to go to any end, personal sacrifice, and it certainly was in the hours that people were putting in, and I'm sure it was hard on home life, to make it right.
The fact is that there wasn't any question in anybody's mind that we were going to make it work, that we were not going to leave two astronauts on the moon, and that we were going to get them back safely.
Despite their indomitable spirit, at Cape Kennedy, the Grumman team were newcomers. They found themselves continually behind schedule, getting the unproven LEM into the flow, on the stack, and to the moon.
And we got into this environment down there where with the Mercury and Gemini programs preceding our Apollo program, there were a lot of people in the Cocoa Beach and the Cape Kennedy area that were, you know, you might say, well up on the learning curve and very experienced in the whole business of launching vehicles and manned space flight. We were the last large major contractor to come on the team at Kennedy, come on the stack, so to speak. And there was a lot of people who thought that perhaps we didn't have it, you know, from experience and just general know-how to stay up with the crowd. The Cape operation was the last stop on the daisy chain. We at the Kennedy Space Center had the job of taking the ascent and the descent stage and putting them together and doing all of the pre-launch checkout of these vehicles, the ascent and the descent stages, and prepping them for launch.
On July 16, 1969, the greatest engineering achievement in the history of mankind moved from promise to fulfillment. The entire world watched as Apollo 11 cleared the tower at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. For the men and women of Grumman, the sense of participation was strong and sweet. Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins, harnessed in their seats atop this 36-story high Saturn V launch vehicle, headed for the moon 250,000 miles away. Reaching an escape velocity of 24,200 miles per hour, Apollo 11, with its 3 astronauts and command, service, and lunar modules aboard, was injected into its translunar trajectory. Once the accuracy of the flight path was confirmed, the panels of the spacecraft LEM adapter were opened. This allowed the command and attached service modules to separate from the 3rd stage, rotate 180 degrees, and dock with the Eagle. As the lunar module Eagle was pulled from the 3rd stage, Apollo 11 finally settled into its 3-day voyage toward lunar orbit. As Apollo 11 neared its destination, the service module engine was reignited as a retro-rocket to inject the spacecraft into a circular orbit around the moon. As it descended to 80 miles above the cratered surface, Armstrong and Aldrin worked their way through the narrow docking tunnel into the LEM and activated the environmental control system. With its landing gear deployed and landing radar tested, the Eagle used its reaction control jets to separate itself from the command module. The Eagle started down. The descent engine was throttled to regulate the speed of descent. Neil Armstrong pitched the LEM downward for a better view of the lunar terrain. Assisted by onboard computers, he guided the LEM to a level area. There were just a few feet to go to landing, but Apollo 11 was running out of fuel. Less than 40 seconds of maneuvering power left.
Forward, 40 feet down, 2.5, picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward. Contact light.
And then a world holding its collective breath heard.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
It wasn't until some few minutes after the lunar landing, when we solved a particularly pressing anomaly right after landing, that I was able to relax a little bit and let it sink in that after all these years of planning and anticipation and simulation, thank God we'd finally done the real thing.
I can remember just being absolutely galvanized that for all these years, this is what we were coming to. This was a moment of truth. And I guess I just couldn't move, and then when the Eagle has landed, I turned into one of the many weepers that this world knew at that moment.
6.5 hours later, Neil Armstrong became the first person from planet Earth to step onto another celestial body.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Buzz Aldrin joined him, and 2 incredible tourists began their exploration.
Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here.
They gathered moon rocks and soil samples. They planted the American flag, propping it up for a wind-blown effect in the airless void. They set up solar wind and seismic experiments. And they discovered a brand new way to get around in 1/6 the gravity of Earth. Still ahead, the rendezvous with Mike Collins aboard the command module Columbia. Aldrin and Armstrong would have to launch themselves into lunar orbit and do it alone.
A lot of people ask me, what was the most demanding moment of that first landing mission? And to be sure, the landing was the sort of thing that made you hold the arm of the chair rather tightly. But to me, the takeoff was perhaps the most critical one, because first of all, there were only 2 people there getting it ready to go, and it's one of those things where it either worked or didn't work, and it had never really been demonstrated. Had never really been demonstrated. All the other parts of the mission, you could find a back-out mode, but when you had to take off for the moon, that was it. It either worked or didn't work. Well, it worked.
Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. Beautiful. 26, 36 feet per second up.
When the ascent happened, I think my heart stopped. And when it was in orbit was the time that I said, yes, now it has happened. I was very confident that we could rendezvous with the command and service module and then get our astronauts home.
And home they came, to a nation whose confidence had soared to a height we've yet to surpass.
The decade of the 60s, there was no question that there was a sense of competition with the Soviets, and that the Apollo program was considered a regaining of our leadership in technology, and it had impacts in the educational system. It inspired a whole generation of young people to be interested in high technology.
It had a mission description that was fairly simple, go to the moon and back in this decade, that most anyone could understand. And it really had a chord that struck the imagination of not just those involved, but literally anyone on Earth, that this was really going to be the first time people would leave the Earth.
And I think by the time that we landed on the moon, there wasn't any question as to who was preeminent in space technology in the world, and that was the United States. So that goal was achieved.
It is hard to imagine that mankind's first landing on the moon is already ancient history, that 5 more followed. To some, it is the stuff of school books, the lore of elderly engineers. For others, however, it seems like yesterday. And anybody who doubts their accomplishment need only examine what they left behind.
What a ride, what a ride.
Remember, there's 6 of these descent stages today, sitting on the moon, looking right like that, with a made in Bethpage, New York nameplate on them. And that's something that thousands of us Grummanites take great pride in.